basically what it is, I guess, is you at 13 dropping some objects on a table, recording the sound and naming the objects. And that's a very advanced Fluxus piece. So were you in a very advanced kid at that time, or did you have any awareness of avant-garde?
Well, I think Fluxus always sort of had the desire to be innocent. And I think that's sort of what you're saying. But 13 would have been 1972 maybe. I think I was 10 years old in 1968. Yeah, I had a tape recorder, and I was just experimenting with the sound of the tape recorder, and I found that cassette tape, in my mother's house at some point a few years back, and I was listening to it, and it was just me at 13 years old, dropping objects on my desk in my little bedroom, like a coin or a pencil or a rubber band, something that wouldn't make sound, and saying that's the sound of this, and there's no sound. I wasn't really, I don't think at the time I realized that like someday I will use this on a solo record in my 40s. But as it turns out, I did.
But a few years later, I mean, like many New Yorkers, you're not born in New York. As far as I know, you were born in Florida. You grew up in Connecticut, is that right?
Yeah, I was born in Coral Gables, Florida. My father was a university professor at University of Miami. He taught art history and music philosophy, and he found a slightly better paying job up in Connecticut, which is just outside New York City. And so basically my teenage years, my growing years were in New England and in Connecticut. And it gave me access to New York City. It was maybe an hour and a half drive from where I lived. And so by the time I got to be of age, I was always reading about music and rock and roll, and it was kind of an interesting period in the early 70s because you started having much more sort of kind of academic writing about rock and roll as a serious art, as an art music, and not only with writers who were coming out of more of a gonzo style of writing, like Richard Meltzer or Lester Bangs, and magazines that sort of would employ these people, or they would create like Cream magazine out of Detroit, Michigan, but also like Rolling Stone magazine early on was using these writers. But then you had more disparate, marginalized writers like Patti Smith. Before she was a recording artist, she was sort of filing record reviews and doing stories, and they were really interesting to me because they stood apart from the typical academic take on the music, and it was a more emotional take, and it was also a take equating the music with the beauty of like Renaissance art or something. And so that was really interesting to me, where it's like, let's make rock and roll a high art. And so that was a very, for me, like completely inspiring and completely intriguing as a teenager to see this. And I realized that I was somewhat alone in my community seeing these signals, and especially specifically in these kind of underground rock and roll magazines. And knowing that a lot of the activity and a lot of the information was coming out of New York City, which was near enough to where I lived, was fortuitous. I don't know what would have happened if I had lived even 100 miles further or whatever. I don't know. But as it were, it was such a, I found it so alluring that I really wanted to go and see these people, what they looked like. Because I would see pictures of the band Television, or the band The Ramones, or whatever, when they first started. And there's these Patti Smith filed the very first journalist piece on Television in a magazine called Rock Scene, and the title of it was a Bob Dylan quote, where somewhere somebody must stand naked, and it was like this band called Television, and just the fact that a band had a name like that, which is this very sort of, this kind of banal name of an object that's in your household, was completely unusual. And the fact that this band had short hair was really unusual. There's nobody had short hair who played rock and roll at that time. So the idea of walking into a club and seeing a band on stage with their hair short was completely startling and shocking. It was just like, how can that be?
You have an essay somewhere, you wrote an essay where we had some reflections on the fact that the importance of context, that it really meant something different to see those groups in New York when you finally got to go there and see them yourself in the New York clubs, as opposed to seeing them when you were sort of touring and playing out in other venues around the country. Can you sort of expand a little bit?
Well, you certainly, you know, New York City was in its penultimate phase of being a very impoverished place, a very impoverished city in the American landscape. It was not until the 80s when there was actually, when money actually sort of came to New York, and they started to rebuild it as an economic kind of force. Before that, it was denied any funding, like just flat out, by the administration at the time, which was the president at the time. His name was Gerald Ford, and he flat out denied New York City any support and money. And at that point, the city just tanked, and it became a kind of a Wild West zone of poverty and of course crime, and it was a mess. But it was sort of the end of this period of New York where any young person could go there and live for nothing. And it really was, you were able to go there and sort of, live for pennies per day. In the No Way book, it's really some funny interviews with Lydia Lunch, where she talks about how her schemes of getting from like one moment to the next, and if she could make $10 in 1 week, she was set. And so she would do routines like pretending she was blind or something with a cup or whatever. Just enough to make some money. And and she would live for free in a building by telling the landlord that since the building was so run down, that if she lived there, she could protect the building from other people living there and ruin it. And he's like, okay, sure. That was the end of that era of being able to do those kind of scams in New York and live in such a way. And that's right when I entered into there. I moved to New York in early '77, and I had begun to go see bands and such at places like CBGB and Max's Kansas City, and there's a few other places in '76.
You actually went to see Suicide at Max's Kansas City, is that right?
Suicide was the first thing I saw, and it had nothing to do with going to see Suicide. It had everything to do with going to New York and wanting to go to one of those clubs. And I wanted to go to CBGB, but I had no idea where it was. And I knew Max's Kansas City was on Park Avenue somewhere. And I basically drove into New York with a friend of mine, and we just yelled out the windows, and where's Park Avenue? Park Avenue runs the entire gamut of the island. So it was just by happenstance that we hit it, and we started looking at addresses, and we zigzagged. I mean, this was like an 8-hour ordeal, which would have only taken 45 minutes. And there it was, and we parked the car, and we went into this place, and it was like 6 p.m. And so the bands didn't really start until like 11 p.m. And we basically just sat there and drinking Coca-Cola the whole time. That's all we could really afford. But we were just so electrified that we were actually in this place, because we knew about the history of the place. We knew that it had this legendary back room where Andy Warhol and the factory habitués would sort of hang out, because the factory was nearby at that time. Before I had moved uptown. So there's all this history that we somewhat knew about, and we were basically we were just in our late teens. And we went upstairs to see the music, and the band that was playing was called Suicide, and the other band was called the Cramps. And the Cramps had just shown up from Cleveland. It was like one of their first shows in New York. And they were the first band on. And people just kind of, the people there, I remember, were just sort of like New York's sort of, you know, sophisticates in a way, and we were just kids. And I remember they kind of just sort of laughed amusingly at the Cramps, and the Cramps were coming out and doing like garage rock songs, which was very strange because there was no culture of that at the time, of actually sort of a band referencing 60s underground garage rock singles. There was just, you know, the only document of that era was a double album that Lenny Kaye had put out in 1972 called Nuggets. And in a way, that was the only documentation historically of that era for people. So it was very sort of arcane. But here was this band actually sort of going further into that catalog and like presenting themselves. And they were completely bizarro, as you can well imagine. And I was just fascinated by them. And then Suicide, I thought, was going to be sort of like a really sort of tough New York hard rock band coming out, like playing like the Dictators or something. And what it was two maniacs, one guy, I mean, completely maniacal. I mean, as a guy, you know, Martin Rev on the synthesizer at just like, you know, just airplane volume, you know, like, and then Alan Vega. And it was a small club. And Alan Vega would just basically, he had an old lady's wig on and white paint smeared on his face and scars that were sort of, you know, I don't know if they were real or not. And he was completely demonic and very confrontational, to the point where he was coming out on the tables and wrapping his microphone cord around, you know, like females' necks and pulling them and grabbing their hair and screaming in their faces, and with like tons of reverb on his voice. And I'd seen some bands before. You know, I saw the Jake Idles band and I saw Peter Frampton, but I never saw this. And I don't think we lasted the whole gig. We got really frightened. And, at some point, I think when he picked up his glass or he picked up somebody's glass off the table and broke it and started like slightly carving his chest, and then like pushing people's faces into his chest. We kind of like, we crawled out because a lot of people in the front had upended their tables to protect themselves. And yeah, so we crawled out of there and we drove home and we were silent. But at some point, we just sort of like, what just happened? And it was like, we have to go back. It was like, we had to go back and sort of see like, what was that?
You actually moved back the year after, quite soon after, beginning of '77. So did you move directly into the